day 2, how much of the stance by Absa and FNB was similar to what we heard yesterday from Standard Bank?
Well, what does emerge is a pattern of invitations following these banks' individual, they say, decision to close Gupta-linked accounts, so the accounts of Gupta-linked companies and individuals. And we've also heard quite significantly about the appetite for risk, or the diminishing appetite for risk that these banks had as information emerged in the public forum, in the public domain through media reports, but also their own investigations. So each bank's official has emphasized the individual processes these banks went through before reaching a conclusion that they were going to close the Gupta-linked accounts. And yeah, that's a common thread throughout the different testimonies.
But of course, the slight switch that we're also hearing today is the firm stance that some banks took in terms of the meeting requests that were sent through from Luthuli House on being called in and wanting to be questioned on the decisions regarding these bank accounts.
Yes, so FNB in particular seems to have been very particular about getting details on what these meetings would entail, who would be attending, what would be the agenda of the meetings, the venues, and so forth. And so in both the case of an invitation from the ANC and from the Interministerial Committee, they did not gather enough information to then follow through with the proper meetings. In the case of Absa, Absa agreed to meet with the ANC, and this was after Gwede Mantashe approached the CEO of Absa at a business event and invited her to meet him the following day. So Absa met with ANC but did not meet with the Interministerial Committee for much the same reasons that FNB chose not to. They didn't have information on what the agenda of the meeting would be, the substance of the meeting, who would attend, and so forth.
Perhaps let's take a listen to that bite that was played at the Commission as one of the legal representatives talks about this meeting that was called by Gwede Mantashe.
Does not comply with the regulatory framework of the country in which you operate, there will be reputational risk associated with non-compliance. There will also be reputational risk if a bank conducts in activities which are regarded by stakeholders as immoral, illegal, unethical. Or an institution will suffer reputational risk if its client base are involved in activities that introduce reputational risk onto the institution. Those are the three broad definitions. I think it's absolutely critical that the reputation and trust of a financial institution is sacrosanct. A financial institution will not survive if its reputation and trust is not absolutely intact. That's why it's so critical that a bank, even the legislation prescribes banks to make sure that they manage reputational risk, because the negative consequences of negative reputational risk on the institution has dire consequences on the business and the ability of the business to survive in the future.
Our CEO attended a meeting of BLSA, that's Business Leadership South Africa. At that meeting, she was approached by Mr. Gwede Mantashe to come to the meeting the next day, and we list in our affidavit what the rationale for the meeting was.
Thanks. Can you please, for the record, state what was discussed in that meeting, and also tell us what was your take of this meeting?
Okay. Thanks, Chair. At the meeting, and if I may chronologically run you through what happened at the meeting was opened by the Secretary General of the ANC, Mr. Mantashe, who indicated that the meeting was not to discuss client and customer information, predominantly because our CEO started the meeting by making it explicitly clear that should the meeting involve discussing client confidential information, we would not be able to partake in it.
Erin, when she talks about private client information, what is reference? What falls under that? Because surely, even being able to have a conversation around the nature of transactions that are taking place in an account should be confidential information.
Yes, I think what's difficult about answering that question is one that I'm not clear on all of the legislation around banking and what they can and cannot disclose, but also that maybe saying what you can't say sort of indicates what the substance of it is, if you understand my meaning. So what we do know is that banking legislation, and several of the witnesses have emphasized this in the inquiry, is really strict about what can be disclosed. And that goes in terms of what banks can tell one another about their relationship with clients, what they can disclose to formal institutions like the Financial Intelligence Center, and to parties like the ANC or the Interministerial Committee that wanted these meetings. And so the banks are very cognizant, and that's evident from the testimony that we've heard, of not being able to disclose in detail the nature of the accounts with various Gupta-linked companies and individuals. And so the banks were willing, it seems on the part of Absa at least, to have an engagement as long as it didn't traverse that terrain. They could talk about the regulatory frameworks, they could talk about a constitutional court judgment about when banks can make a decision to end a relationship, but they didn't really want to go into, it seems, the substance of maybe transactions, movement of monies, and the like. And what's interesting about the testimony of Johan Burger, who was at the time the CEO of the First Rand Group, which holds First National Bank, is that he said he had communication from Nazim Hauer, who was then the CEO of Oak Bay Investments, asking for the details of what FNB had passed on to the Financial Intelligence Center on Gupta-linked accounts. And that's something Burger said they were not permitted to do in law, to tell Nazim Hauer and Oak Bay what information they were handing over to a regulatory body.
Well, certainly one party that is not convinced that the banks have any moral high ground to stand on this particular story is the EFF. In a statement they've issued, they've said, well, it's actually opportunistic and hypocritical of the banks to come out now when, in fact, the only reason they decided to cancel these accounts was post the public outcry over the Gupta family and whatever looting they may have been involved in where the state is concerned. From what you've heard from the testimony yesterday, also taken into account, is that, does that hold some water, given how long the Guptas had bank accounts with these banks and the final decisions as to why, in fact, their accounts were closed?
Well, what's interesting about the testimony from the bank officials is that they've underlined what led to their decisions, these internal investigations, the poor reputation that the Guptas had in the public domain, and that they simply could not afford the risk of working with them and their associated companies. But of course, we know, as the general public in South Africa, that the cat was proverbially out of the bag from the moment that private jet landed at Waterkloof Air Force Base in 2013. The political exposure, the political clout that the Gupta family had, its proximity to people who were decision makers in national government was clear from the moment the wheels of that plane landed on that runway. And so perhaps there is a legitimate question to ask about what appetite the banks had for risk with this politically exposed family and its companies from 2013 to 2016 when these accounts were closed. And what the testimony seems to indicate is that the banks were very careful, they say, and that they had to follow their own policies and procedures to make the decision in 2016. But what they've also said, which is interesting in light of the EFF statement, which highlights the weekend special phenomenon of late 2015, is that the banks only acted, it seems, after the financial sector in South Africa was so volatile, was so sort of topsy-turvy following that astounding weekend special where we had a finance minister for a matter of days.
Basically, when it hit them, where it hurts the most.
Exactly.